Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This is the American election week. This is midway through the week, and I know it's been a stressful week for many people, including myself, in anticipation of what the American election results would be. And we are constantly updating our phones, and we're checking different news outlets in order to know what the results are. And as of Thursday morning, we don't know. But I think even next Thursday morning, we probably are still going to be up in the air about a few things, but that's neither here nor there. So when I was thinking about how to incorporate this series into this conversation that's happening, I came across an article that was about the news agencies, international news agencies, reporting on the Bush-Gore election in 2000 and the pressures that journalists were under to be able to come up with news stories that weren't yet complete. And it turns out it wasn't an article, it was actually a chapter in a book. And it was so exciting to be able to connect with the author, to be able to say, would you want to talk about the history of international news agencies and to talk about the 2000 Bush-Gore election related to these news archives that you looked at, in order for us to think more critically about the international news, how we're getting the news, how stories get created, in order for us to be able to think about this current moment. And he said yes, which I am so excited about, because Dr. Michael Palmer is a professor emeritus at the Université de Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle. So a very prestigious university, a very prestigious scholar. He has written numerous books, over 100 articles, and I'm so thankful that he agreed to talk with me for this series about the book in its entirety, but the specific chapter on the Bush-Gore election and how we can think about this moment with things like fake news, with our constantly checking our phones, to be able to think about how we can be more critical, or how we can be aware of the people and the processes behind the news. And I'm just so pleased to speak with him. So pleased, in fact, that because he's in Paris and I am in Toronto, I am up very early. But it is worth it, because to be able to speak with such a scholar is such a treat. So I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Let's go over to Zoom. Well, hello, bonjour. I'm so happy to speak with you early this morning for me. I know it's afternoon for you. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me. I think it's such an important moment for us to think about journalism and think about how we're getting information. And I can't think of a better election to draw on than the 2000 election. So thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me.
Fine, very good. Delighted to do so.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Michael Palmer, half French, half English, but now since 1980s based in France, Paris. Have written either sole-authored or co-authored about 12 books and 150 articles, many of them on media history. My main focus of research since the 1980s has been international news and international news agencies. I am an emeritus professor of the Université de Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle, based in Paris, but I don't teach anymore, thank goodness. And but very many research doctoral students have remained good friends.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment if you were teaching, because it's so much new technology, and it's such an interesting thing about how the medium changes the message, or if it does. And I think that because so many of us are at home right now, I think we're consumed with more news than we were before, because it's just so easy to flip over, which seems so odd because so many of us are just attached to our phones normally.
But already in the 17th century, there was a learned English gentleman who said, "I'm snowed under with news." So it's not a new phenomenon.
You know, as someone with a history background, I always cringe when people say things about students like, "Oh, students these days don't know this," or they're not politically aware. And I mean, I just did that about news. So thank you for that quote. I'm going to definitely use it.
You're welcome, as you say in American.
So, we are going to talk about a chapter in your book that I found really intriguing when I was doing some research about how we should talk about this election for this video series. And this book, International News Agencies, A History, covers a very large time period, despite it not being a very hefty book and a very comfortable read. Um, and one of the chapters is on the 2000 election. Before we talk about that chapter, do you want to talk about the book in its entirety?
Well, as I've been working one time as a news agency journalist, above all as a historian working in the archives for over about 50 years, I'm horrified to realize. I started off with the French news agency. It was called Havas since 1944. It's called AFP, Agence France Presse. But over the years, I've also done a lot of research in Reuters, which was based in Britain until 2007-8, when it was taken over by a Canadian company, your friend Mr. Thompson, and is now called Thomson Reuters. And I've also done work, but to a lesser extent, in the archives of Associated Press in New York. Now, we always have a problem in definition. Are we talking about the actual news product, news stories that go out? And that is obviously a major concern. But I've also been looking at company archives and supplementing company archives from sources like National Archives in France, Britain, and the States.
And
And over the
so,
years, sorry,
no, please.
over the years, some very colorful characters have emerged. My argument is that international news agencies, while media people and others recognize their importance, for a long time they were what one might call unsung heroes. They did not, and they intentionally did not attract a lot of attention. They said our aim is to serve clients, whether they're media, whether they're governments, whether they're businesses. We remain intentionally in the background. That has changed a little in the last 20 or 30 years, but still they tend to remain in the background.
So, is this the first history then of international news agencies?
Is this, sorry, I didn't hear. Is
Is
this
this
the
the
first
first
history?
history? Yeah.
It's the first history that takes a very long time span. The
Mm.
French news agency was the first. It starts in the 1830s. And here my idea was to look at the history of all three of the major ones, plus a few others. The major British one, Reuters, despite its funny name, it was founded by a German, but it was until the early 2000s based in London. And then the French news agencies were the first, 1830s, but they have gone through various mutations, to put it politely. And the current one is AFP, Agence France Presse.
And so, over that large time span, which is almost the like length of Canada as a country, have you found some like major, or what were some major trends about international news agencies that being able to see such a long time period you were able to highlight?
Well, the first point was that, say, both AP, Associated Press, and the French agencies, initially, they were solely concerned with their domestic clients, their domestic subscribers. But, first of all, governments very quickly took an interest. And for these three leading agencies, Reuters, AP, and Havas, the then French agency, to become really the top people in the field, they therefore expanded their international news networks. And at one stage, between the 1870s, late 60s, and mid 1940s, they were cooperating together. Each they had what some people call a cartel, they called it a pool, and they were exchanging their own domestic and colonial news, the one with the other. But that changes largely through a character from the Associated Press called Kent Cooper, who in the 1930s and 40s battled with a messianic zeal for AP to be able to do its own thing and not depend on the other major international agencies.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're like, oh, some people call it cartels, some people call it pools, because those types of, I mean, conglomerates is a different word, can work really to an advantage, or it becomes a bit of a silo of ideas and thoughts. And I mean, we think about that a lot right now because of the media that a lot of us are engaging in because of the American election. But yes, there are times throughout history where that would have been the case. In or even not even through history, but just like not having an event. But sometimes through an event we can think about that, but it's always there.
Well, the point was that, say, in the late 19th century, in fact, until the First World War, 1914-18, these major domestic agencies which wanted to become international, they didn't have enough resources to really cover the world. So they had to work together.
Right.
And the danger was that some of the news relayed was very much official news, governmental news. That certainly didn't appeal to, say, AP.
Right.
AP didn't want to have to depend for its European news on government influenced or sponsored or financed European news agencies.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of that history. Sorry, I have cats. Let's talk about some of that history in relation to further down in history, or further up, I guess, in the 2000 Bush versus Gore election, because that was a very contentious election. And a lot of people have been talking about it in relationship to like the courts, the courts being involved, and that's going to be the case in America for this election. Can you tell us a little bit about this chapter kind of on a whole? And then I have some questions about the specific primary sources and other things that you drew to kind of talk about this, moment.
Good news. Well, I shouldn't say good news, but anyhow, good question. The point was that basically within the States, by the 1890s, the Associated Press, which, as you know, is a cooperative, had really become the main source of election coverage, just the basic results, for the US media and North American media. And so that was one longest, there's a man called Wolf, who did a wonderful chapter in one of his books on that issue. So AP long had a dominant position in covering election news. Secondly, from 1907, what would be called United Press and then United Press International, which became the second major domestic US agency, they likewise developed their coverage of election news. In fact, not just election news, but covering top politicians. There's a celebrated battle between an AP man and a UPI man when poor Jack Kennedy was shot, who the AP man or the UPI man would first get the really immediate coverage out, story out. So that shows the length of the thing. From the 1960s, and especially the 1970s, the British agency, Reuters, beefed up its presence in the US. And while it accepted that it had to be, quote, a secondary agency, nonetheless was more and more respected within the International News Agency network, even for covering US political and presidential news. And so what I did in that chapter, there's an immense problem one has to start off with in terms of the sheer output, the vast product, news product that comes out of these agencies. You cannot pretend to monitor everything. You cannot possibly pretend to monitor anything. So I decided when the election was coming up, this 2000 period was seen to me particularly useful. A, because Reuters had been beefing up its US presence. B, because it was adjusting and using the internet. Some people say it was too slow in adapting to the internet, but nonetheless it was doing so. And that was really on the case with the 2000 election. And C, or third point, I had access in various archives, agency archives, to what I call quality control. That is to say, how news agencies themselves evaluate and monitor their own product, the use of that product, the style of the news product, and also how the rivals are doing it. And so this was a material that I got hold of from Reuters from the late 1980s, and also for AP, but more slowly. And likewise, of course, friend Bloomberg, the other new agency player in the States, had got going. Now, this raised the problem, the fact that both Reuters and Bloomberg, even more than AP, which at the time had a connection with Dow Jones, even more, they were monitoring above all financial news, economic news, and that is, of course, the linchpin. That is where they get most of their money from. So what I found with the 2000 elections, A, it was going to be very tight, it seemed. The predictions were that it was tight, it would be tight, and B, I had access to this material. Already you have these quality control reports. You have 3 or 4 a day at least. And what have we done? How are the competitors doing, etc. So my main source was the Reuters, and so I put all this together, and hence this chapter. Above all, the fact that it was so tight didn't help matters, but it also caused great confusion because of not only the agency's own reports, but they were monitoring American Online, Yahoo, etc. So you had all this input, and what does Reuters use? What does it not use? This was, but in terms of instant news, this was a wonderful issue to survey.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you highlight right in the beginning of the chapter which archives that you are looking at. And the first time I looked at this chapter, I also thought that you engaged in some interviews because of the very like conversational tone of some of the notes. But when you're talking about like the different checking, it's because it's all that behind the scenes stuff, and we're so used to a polished journalistic product. But of course, how the sausage is made, we often don't explore with journalism.
Well, I did interview some of the agency journalists who were involved in this monitoring process, but most of the material came from these frenetically typed out, not typed, but whatever you do on a keyboard. Most of the information came from this monitoring of their own internal exchanges. That, to me, was the most attractive thing. How do the journalists themselves discuss what within the next minute or so is coming up, and how they say the all importance of desking. That is, for both the poor newsmen who are out in the field trying to cover this frenetic pace of the election and the results as they come in, but also the all importance of people in the news desks who are polishing the copy. And do they always manage to render the precise story that the newsmen in the field had typed in? Sometimes newsmen in the field said, no, we we don't agree with the way you've polished our copy.
And so was that the main takeaway for you, that that communication piece between out in the field and in the newsroom about how stories during a hectic moment like this, where the idea is just to get the story out really fast, that things can get lost, or how the crafting of a published piece comes together? Like, what was a key takeaway that you thought at that particular moment, that 2000 election, was kind of interesting, especially with the changing landscape of the news media, because there was no online for World War II, right?
Sure, sure. No, well, say to take the example of when there was a Supreme Court, there was a court in Florida, and then the Supreme Court, when they would finally pass judgment, and how the judges would vote. And this was monitored, as I doubt this, perhaps Amy Barrett will be monitored now,
Right.
but it was monitored, and agency men were saying, oh God, sometimes when you get an official rending or an official judgment from a Supreme Court, sometimes the lawyer or the judge will start by quoting the evidence that leads him to conclude one way, but then finally he'll conclude the other way. And if we don't have, we can't see the transcript of what he's going to say. So we mustn't go with what he says. First of all, we have to wait till the final part of when he's finished reading his judgment. And this was causing nightmares among some agency men, because some didn't get this point. So some went, if he said, let us say, the first evidence showed that Paul was going to win. So if he just stuck with that, he would get it wrong, because the final decision would go down with Bush. It was this kind of tenterhook situation that, was wonderful for me to monitor. I working on the basis of how they monitored things.
Right. Yeah, because with that stress of getting a story out, and with experience as a journalist, you might think you're going in a justice is going in one direction, and how to balance that when when you have to listen to like the 3-hour opinion, for example, the 3-hour decision. I loved this quote that you had here. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Where it says, we journalists are responsible for the general impression that we convey, as well as the exact words that we use. And I really like this. I really liked how they both are talking about like discourse as well as rhetoric. Were other people kind of thoughtful about that impression and versus words?
Well, one has to distinguish between, say, customers, clients of the agency. In that same reference quote that you mentioned, there's this obsession with market movers. That is to say, financiers, stock exchange people, people playing the market, and also governments, who are monitoring the things in the instant. Even they talk about shadowing the instant. And then they would be saying, oh God, market movers, the slightest indication that something may happen, then they will make big financial transactions. But if the second part of the judgment goes against what the first part said, then perhaps they'll make the wrong judgments. So it's this idea of you're trying to serve market moving financial clients, as well as governments, as well as the media and other end users. And how on earth do you make sure either you get the story correctly, but the point being, yes, you must use the right words. And say one of the favorable comments that waiters like to quote about themselves was the fact that at the time it was done rather, and he was saying, the Reuters journalist covering this has got not only factually the best account, but the words he uses are the best.
Mm-hmm. It's yeah, see, like that's such an interesting way of thinking about like having the facts correct and having them articulated right, and then also being able to use those right words to be able to tell a really evocative story, while ensuring that the facts are out. Because with all this talk of like fake news, for example, you know, a lot of people are just like, oh, it's just the story, like the facts. But I don't know, the facts aren't there anymore. So that's such an interesting way to draw from this moment to think about that. I also really love the way that this chapter ended, with this bittersweet piece. Okay, it's 4 o'clock, and then here it was like 12 minutes gone, 4 paragraphs, and then here at the end it was like repeat this 8 to 10 times a day for 6 months or more. Can you tell me a little bit about ending the chapter with this piece and this kind of like takeaway from it?
Sure. Well, the man who wrote that, he was the main Reuters man covering the election, Elsner, and it struck me that way he summed up with about 4 or 5 paragraphs of all the pressure he'd been through, not just him but others, and the shifts and change, the changing scene. How on earth could he manage to do this? Forever we knew his story. Yes, but then there'll be a change. You'd have to have a factual lead, okay? But if you just say that, then it'll be a bit dull.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to use the phrase, the court threw the nation into a constitutional crisis. And then you're trying to do your piece. You're also listening in the background to what they're saying on the telly, on the television, what Yahoo is saying or whatever. You simply have to take, telephone is ringing. You have somehow to keep your calm, isolate yourself for at least 10 seconds before you write what you hope will be the final part of that story. And then where do you place that? What do you put in the first paragraph, the second paragraph, the third paragraph? And something you put in the fourth paragraph, you'll suddenly decide in terms of what the news that's coming at you from all sides, God, it should be in the first paragraph. So forever having to rejig your piece, reorganize it, you're going berserk, but you have to remain calm. You have to remain cool. And I found that these paragraphs that Elsner wrote precisely captured all the pressures that had been going on, not just for the final days, but for weeks and months that these agency men had been under.
And it's interesting at the end here about feelings. One thing that I talk a lot about in the video series is the importance of feelings in history, that I think that students should be able to really process their feelings and their experiences with history as a way to learn history to make change. And an approach to doing history that is very disciplinary doesn't really want those emotions. But I find that when we're looking through the archives, and we can actually see these kind of hints of emotion that's nice to react to. And I think it's interesting here that's like, okay, you know, somebody wants this moving and blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to avoid these negative feelings because all I've done is try to like rush. And I think that it's so easy to think of journalism as just like putting out these stories for the people, for the businesses, for the market watchers. But to think of the people behind the stories, I think is really interesting, which is why I thought this chapter, but the book in its entirety is so interesting.
Well, the point there is this, in that particular quote, he's saying, Elsner, God, I've done all I can, and now the people monitoring what I'm doing within the agency criticizes you should have moved a paragraph from A to B, and then when he the journalist himself, you feel failure, futility. His hands are trembling, so immediately he mustn't let his emotions take over. He has to yet again do another write another lead. So that was that particular case. But you mentioned fake news or whatever, and the point there is that since 2000, we've been through not just Mr. Trump but other people making this big issue of fake news, and people really wondering, how do you discriminate between true news and fantasy news, because that's what it is. But fantasy news with a purpose, there's an intention behind it. That is something we have now that we didn't have in the year 2000. And the point being that in the past we used to have news, we had propaganda, we had misinformation, but now we seem to have also disinformation, that is criticizing straight news and even misinformation that's been related, and people are losing the sense of what truly is happening, especially as the emotion side is that people are believing some of this fake news, and that explains much of what seems to be going on Facebook and like other similar things. So all these pressures, inside, outside, professional, non-professional, are impacting on the poor journalists. And they themselves also wondering, will these print news media survive? We have to go on screen, but if we go on screen, online, then we have a series of other pressures. One of the things I found interesting was that writers in the 1990s, more and more, they had long just been on print, but they were moving online, and they had more and more stories for television news flashes or whatever. And they were saying, God, you journalists of the print media, you have to accept and adjust to the fact that be visual. Even your own written text must be visual. And of course, when you have things visual, then you imagine that the emotion will be greater than if it's just straight print factual news. So that there was yet another series of pressures that were building up. I've always been surprised that more news agency people just don't go mad.
Yeah, totally.
That was not a nice thing to say, but okay, they're professionals, they can avoid madness. Good.
I listened to the podcast, The Daily, from the New York Times. I don't know, do you listen to that at all?
Not often.
No. And so, there's a host that's interviewing a journalist about an article or about an investigation. And sometimes because they know each other, there's a little bit of banter. And they often they often joke about things like, oh, and then we had to pivot, or I haven't really slept today, or there's just a lot of pressure. And I like listening to it because it does show that humanity and how they need to have a sense of humor and be connected. Otherwise, they could very well go mad.
Sure. Well, the poor news agency people, they can sometimes, not in the main news report, but in sidebars, in secondary pieces, think pieces, sometimes they can write with humor. But basically, facts, they are fact obsessed, and the maximum amount of information, news and information in the smallest number of words. They are trained to do that. It is the humor is for other pieces. It's not in the main story.
Sometimes the humor is the story. You were talking about fake news, to be able to just identify how there's so many inaccuracies that are rampant, that to bring more humor to something that is already very confusing and perhaps humorous, I'm sure is a struggle too. To talk about the fake news, as a way to kind of end our conversation, from doing this history of the international news agencies, looking at the archives of the agencies themselves, do you have any thoughts about this particular moment in journalism related to the American election, and things that you think international news agencies are going through, journalists are going through, things that teachers should encourage their students to think about when they are reading the news, when they're covering the news, to understand this particular moment?
Well, I didn't think I'm going to answer your question spot on, but nonetheless, AP, Associated Press, in the States, even if CNN and others have joined in the last 20 years or so, remains the source, the news agency source, on whom most people rely.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a piece today in the leading French quality daily newspaper is Le Monde. And Le Monde just apologized this morning because they'd gone with an AP report about the election results. I can't remember if it was Arizona or Nevada, one of the two. And AP had done its work properly, but nonetheless, the report had tended to indicate that one type of result was possible. And then Le Monde later wrote a correction saying, we shouldn't have used that because the final result hasn't yet been announced. Okay, so these are poor people, reliable, recognized, reputable sources, AP and Le Monde. One, as usual, the media live off the other media. That is, but everybody uses one another. That's long been the case since the 17th century. It was the case. Anyhow, so here, when you have one reputable source apologizing for using another reputable source that perhaps gave a misleading report, or it could have been read in a misleading way, that shows us how even the established players who have all their reputation at stake sometimes make a slip. And it's quite normal. These are very few compared to the ridiculous things that come out on Facebook and the rest of it. But nobody is imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody. All the precautions you take, all the possible verifications, fact-checking, etc., something will slip through. And sometimes it's not just the fact itself, it's the way it's written up, the word used. So you have to all the time be conscious of both these factors. And as for the present scene, well, in France, we likewise been monitoring Trump, Biden, how the results are falling. It now seems as if Biden has a very good chance. There's a lot of hostility, I think that's the right word to use, in France towards Mr. Trump. But that's a simplistic statement. There are also Trump people who support him. But nonetheless, the feeling here is, for God's sake, if only Biden can do it. And there is great analysis of how the different ethnic communities and the class composition, social class composition, how did they vote in X or Y state? And so that is going to be our take on the story. There is a belief that probably Biden will get it. There's likewise a belief that we're going to have 2 or 3 months of argy-bargy in the courts. Mr. Trump has led us to believe that. Perhaps there'll be a news best-selling book on the Trump quotes in the period between now and the next 2-3 months. What he will be saying, Amy, please, do not forget I got you appointed. You must back me. Right. You must twist the arms of all the other conservatives. What else will happen? But no, I'm laughing. But the point is that
you have to laugh or you have to cry.
Sure.
Yeah.
That is your emotions. Is
That's
one
right.
or the other. Sometimes it's both.
That's
what
right.
a mess we're in.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I really appreciate that historical perspective on international news agencies and how and just the pressures that journalists are under, especially in a moment like this where people are hungry for news and hungry for an answer, and an answer that nobody actually has, and that, you know, there's that pressure too of getting the story, finishing the story when you're right in the middle of it, right? Like wanting to say Nevada got it or Arizona got it when we still don't know,
Sure.
right? Yeah. Dr. Palmer, it was such a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me all the way from Paris. Although I had to wake up early, you didn't. But it was worth it. It was so wonderful. This was just
I've been
really,
busy since,
pardon me?
sorry, I've been busy. I've been busy since 6 in the morning.
Oh, well, I haven't woken up this early since the pandemic started. So, but I
Well,
work.
everything will end. Trump will end. The pandemic will end. We'll all live happily ever after on a desert island.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really hoping for some island time fairly soon. It was wonderful to talk with you. Thank you so much. I will provide a link to your book for people that are interested in reading the whole thing, or the chapter I was able to get to that I was saying to you, just like kind of as a journal article. And
Sure.
I was able to access the book through the University of Toronto University of Toronto library system. And so I think that it's very accessible for people if they didn't want to buy it right away, to be able to read it first. So thank you.
And never forget to vote well.
Yeah, exactly. Au revoir.
Okay. Au revoir, madame.